Well, we're back. MBS KFEL Denver, Monday, March 16th, 1942, 7:15 to 7:30 p.m. Mountain West Time. An analysis of propaganda by Siegfried Wagener. Good evening. That man spoke again. That man, who unloosened all the furies of hell on this world, who unleashed not only the dogs of war on us, but what is worse, who uncorked the bottle of the worst vices and criminal instincts which has ever harnessed humankind. There is no precedent in history which that man Hitler could use as an excuse for this horrendous crime. No Nero, no Caesar, no Genghis Khan, no Attila ever stooped so low. They were self-respecting men, and Hitler is not. That man, devoid even of the honor of a thief, said nothing new. He never does. His mind can grasp only a few things, and these things he repeats over and over again. The thing now uppermost in his mind is his possible defeat. He speaks no longer of victory, but of the terrifying sacrifices which lie ahead of the German people in its fight against practically the whole world. He did, however, at last admit there is one enemy whom he fears most. It is not Russia, but the United States of America. He did not admit this fear voluntarily. The very forces of evil which he unleashed forced this admission. No matter what he and his trained SEALs have been saying in the past about the weakness, unpreparedness, and internal dissension of the United States, the German public was always scared stiff that we would again tip the balance of war in favor of a German defeat. And now, American forces are in Ireland, and the word comes from Burma and Australia that American airplanes and men may soon turn the tide against the Jap. It was time for Hitler to recognize the American danger publicly. It was time for him to forsake his nefarious propaganda method of discounting the American threat. Had he not done so now, had he insisted on continuing to conceal the one potential in this war which worries the Germans the most, more of his own soldiers might have shot their officers and refused to go on fighting a war about which they say again, as they did in 1918, that there are too many dogs for the German rabbit to survive. It was General de Gaulle's Free French radio station in Brazzaville, West Africa, which reported that German soldiers in occupied France had risen up in open mutiny and shot a number of their officers. If true, I consider this the most significant piece of news since the Russian counteroffensive began last fall. I credit the de Gaulle report with much more importance than is generally done because I was once in the same position as these German mutineers when I was a private in the German army from 1916 to 1918. I too was a rebel, and I know just how much it takes for a German soldier to abandon all caution and openly kill his superior officers. Of course, the report may be a piece of free French propaganda aimed at giving fresh hope to the courageous men and women who carry on the V for Victory campaign. I would think so if there had not been for some time persistent rumors and reports, mainly by London and Moscow radio stations, of unrest, mutinies, and executions among German occupation forces in France. The latest definite report was a few weeks ago that a number of German soldiers had been executed because they refused to return to the Russian front after a period of recuperation in France. What lent credence to these reports was the fact that they increased in number and scope with Hitler's setbacks in Russia. Hence, the de Gaulle report does not stand alone, and it may be assumed that it is essentially correct. In which case it betrays a revolutionary spirit in the German army comparable to that shortly before the November Revolution in 1918. As I previously stated in these broadcasts, the revolution of 1918 really got its start in the fall of 1917, even though the Allies and even the general public in Germany knew little, if anything, about it. The reason was that up to October 1918, few if any cases of open mutiny and disobedience occurred. It was the preparatory stage of the revolution, the most which the rebellious men and women of Germany did during this stage was to spread and deepen the general disgust with the war. Subsequently, the army hospitals filled up with cases of war psychosis, commonly called the jitters, or gold bricks and Dodgers on even larger scale. Gold bricks and Dodgers. So the hospitals are filling up with people from the wars that, like post-traumatic syndrome or jitters. And he calls it gold bricks and Dodgers on even a larger scale. Back to the front line and at home, the military police proved insufficient to cope with the rising tide of soldiers who stayed in hiding and refused to return to the front. These deserters were helped by civilians whenever possible, and I recall one case where a comrade of mine blatantly played hide-and-seek with his pursuers in a public park in Berlin while hundreds of people looked on with uncontrolled merriment and finally helped him to escape. So the German people helped the German soldiers escape. But none of these tens of thousands and later hundreds of thousands of potential mutineers had the courage to take a revolver and shoot at superior officers. Their wrath had not yet risen to the point of defying the firing squad. In a sense, they were all cowards, trying to let George do it and ask for the assurance of an organized mass rising in which they could submerge in the case things got too hot. You could hardly call them heroes, but neither could they be blamed for not wanting to stick their necks out as long as they didn't feel that a large part of the public stood solidly behind them. They preferred mob action, and they were not so constituted as to fight for their own convictions alone and unaided. But in that respect, the Nazi soldier of today is even worse. Hitler has trained him to never venture something alone and always to wait until his mob has gained such superior numbers that beating an enemy to the pulp can be done with the least risk for the individual. It is at this point where the de Gaulle report gains its importance, in my opinion. If it is true that German soldiers are shooting their officers, even in isolated cases, then this is conclusive proof that they know a majority of their comrades and civilians at home are back of them. They may be, as in all revolutionary members, a small, courageous, and usually lost vanguard, but they definitely do not act as inconsequential individuals. They are in all events the representatives of the widespread movement, and as such, of far greater consequence than is generally assumed in this country. It makes little difference whether or not they have been incited by communist propaganda, as de Gaulle had reported it. Communist propaganda today is rampant in the Central Europe and in France, but it can become effective only after people are sufficiently disgusted with that man Hitler to take clubs, pitchforks, revolvers to his officers and policemen. It is, however, of added significance that in 1917 and 1918, also, the communists told the German rebels how to go about kicking out the Kaiser. They followed the advice punctuously, except that they were either too cowardly, too decent to liquidate the very generals and officers who used Hitler to start this war. It was unfortunate, but it won't happen again. While I'm on this subject, it might be well to clear up the widespread misconception. Many people believe that the unavoidable German Revolution won't have a ghost of a chance against Hitler's Gestapo and Black Guards. That is a myth, which not even Himmler and Heinrich would believe. In the last German Revolution, I once disarmed more than a dozen heavily armed policemen single-handed, not because they were scared of me, they could have made Liberty Steak out of me on a short order, but because they wanted to give themselves up. We shall see the same thing happen again. Hitler's followers are among themselves even more disunited than were Kaiser's minions. Any refugee who escaped from Nazi concentration camps can testify as to that. Any refugee who escaped Nazi concentration camps testify as to that. It is only the top men in his organization, gangsters and desperados, one and all, who have by brutality and ruthlessness lent credence to Hitler's propaganda that his millions of partisans will stand by him come what may. So no matter whatever comes, Hitler is telling everybody, my people are with me. And this guy is saying, no, they're not. But neither Hitler nor his propaganda chief are fooled by it. They are so scared of an eternal dissension that they never dare to answer the charges made by prominent German refugees like Thomas Mann or Otto Strasser. They never mention Rudolf Hess. They know that if they did, the German people might now explode right in their faces. But let no one get the idea that the German Revolution is just around the corner. It will come, of that I'm sure, but when it will come depends solely on our hard-fisted production men, on our army, our navy, and on you, and on me. Only when our guns, planes, tanks, ships have knocked the last shred of faith in Hitler out of the German people has anyone a right to expect that they will hang him. And this is my analysis of propaganda for the present. The shortwave stations to which I have referred to were Berlin, DXJ, London, GSC, GRH, Moscow, RV-11 and 15, and Radio Brazzaville, Brazzaville, Brazzaville. Good night.